Congratulations. You've just been married. To a god. He won't be attending the ceremony. He's made of stone. But don't worry. Plenty of his human representatives will be around to fill in. Welcome to your life as a Devadasi, a sacred servant of the divine. A woman dedicated to temple service, religious ritual, music, dance, and, depending on who you ask, which century you're in, and how honest they're willing to be, sex. This is the story of one of the most misunderstood, misrepresented, and deliberately erased institutions in human history. The word Devadasi comes from Sanskrit. Deva means God. Desai means female servant. So literally, servant of God. Simple enough. Except almost nothing about this institution was simple. The Devadasi system as a formalized institution appears in historical record from around the 6th century CE, though evidence of women dedicated to temple service goes back much further, possibly to the Vedic period. At its height, roughly 900 CE to 1300 CE, during the Chola Empire, the Devadasi system was prestigious, respected, and well-funded. The major temples of South India employed hundreds of Devadasis. The Brihadisar temple alone, according to inscriptions commissioned by King Rajaraja around 1010 CE, had 400 Devadasis on its official payroll. 400. These women were state-funded religious professionals. They received land grants. They had legal rights that most Indian women of the time did not have. They could own property, inherit, and conduct business transactions independently. To put that in context, the average upper-caste Hindu woman of this period was expected to be entirely dependent on her father, then her husband, then her son. The Devadasi, by contrast, was essentially legally autonomous. So was she a servant of God, or one of the freest women in medieval India? The answer, as with everything in this story, is both, and also neither, and it's complicated. Let's back up to how you ended up here in the first place. You didn't choose this. You were chosen. The dedication of a girl to the temple typically happened between the ages of 5 and 12, before puberty. This was important. The girl had to be dedicated while she was still ritually pure, before she could be claimed by a mortal man. The reasons a family might dedicate a daughter varied enormously. Some families genuinely believed they were doing something holy. Giving their daughter to God was the highest honor. She would be spiritually elevated, never widowed, because her husband, the god, could never die. If you were from a lower caste, dedicating a daughter to the temple was one of the very few paths to social elevation. A Devadasi outranked many people who outrank her family by birth. In other cases, it was economic desperation. The temple paid in land grants and food. A family with too many daughters and not enough resources saw the temple as a solution, especially in times of drought. Finally, some girls were identified by priests as being marked by God. A birthmark or an auspicious star sign meant they were considered to have already been chosen. The dedication ceremony itself was a formal marriage ritual. The girl was married to the presiding deity of the temple. She received a tali, the sacred necklace that in regular Hindu marriage would come from a husband. After the ceremony, she was officially a married woman to a deity. She could never be married to a mortal, which meant she was available to mortal men in a very specific, complicated, and deeply uncomfortable way. Before anything else, you were trained extensively. These women were not primarily defined by sex. They were primarily defined by art. The central art form of the Devadasi was Bharatanatyam. The entire tradition of Bharatanatyam, as we know it, was developed, preserved, and transmitted almost exclusively by Devadasis for over 1,000 years. Every hand gesture, every eye movement, every footwear pattern was passed down from teacher to student, generation after generation. The performances weren't entertainment in the modern sense. They were ritual. When a Devadasi danced before the deity, she was believed to be animating the god's presence. She was a vessel of sacred energy. Beyond dance, a Devadasi was trained in vocal music, instrumental music, particularly the veena, and the recitation of Sanskrit and Tamil devotional poetry. You were also educated. In a society where female literacy was essentially non-existent, Devadasis were trained to read and write. By the time your training was complete, you were one of the most highly educated women in India. Now, let's talk about the part everyone focuses on. The Devadasi, as a woman married to a deity, could not have a mortal husband, but she could have a patron. This was a man, typically from the nobility, who would enter into a formalized long-term arrangement. This was not casual prostitution. The arrangements were formal and came with financial obligations. A patron was expected to financially support his Devadasi, providing a house, jewelry, and cash income. In return, she was exclusively available to him. Having a Devadasi as a patron arrangement was a status symbol. It signaled wealth and cultural refinement. But here's where the freedom and the exploitation existed simultaneously. Yes, she had legal autonomy and was considered auspicious. Her presence at a wedding was a blessing because she could never be widowed. But she also had no real choice about becoming this. She had been dedicated as a child. The first patron arrangement, typically happening shortly after puberty, was determined by caste hierarchy and temple politics. There was a formalized defloration ceremony in which the first patron relationship was established, often with a payment to the temple. It was an income source for the institution. So, simultaneously, a woman with more legal freedom than almost any other woman of her time, and a woman whose sexual life was structured from childhood without her consent. During the Chola period, the system functioned at its most stable. Temple inscriptions record Devadasis being granted millennium land, tax-free agricultural land, given as payment for temple service. This land belonged to the Devadasi personally. Court Devadasis served at royal courts and were among the closest advisors to kings, privy to state secrets, and wielding genuine political influence. This was the apex. Then things changed. Two things dismantled the Devadasi system. The first was the gradual shift in trade routes and the arrival of the Mughal Empire, which disrupted the patronage networks. Without royal support, the economic foundation cracked. Devadasis who had been landowners became dependent on patron income alone. Then came the British. The colonial administration looked at the Devadasi system and saw one thing: prostitution. The nuance, the land rights, the art, the legal autonomy was invisible to them. The anti-Nach movement was a Victorian moral crusade that began in the 1890s. It was a coalition of British officials and Indian social reformers who argued the system needed to be abolished. Many Indian reformers were sincere, child dedication was wrong, and the lack of consent was real. But the solution destroyed everything: the exploitation and the art and the property rights. The Madras Devadasi Act of 1947 formally prohibited the dedication of women to temples. Overnight, women who had professional identity and income lost everything. The land grants were not transferred to them as private property. Many ended up in street-level sex work because the abolitionists took away their safety net. Here is what survived: the dance. Bharatanatyam was salvaged in the 1930s by people who recognized what was about to be lost. Most famously, Rukmini Devi Arundel, an upper-caste woman, systematized it and brought it to concert halls. But this was its own act of erasure. She stripped the Shringar, the erotic devotional content, from the compositions to make them palatable to middle-class audiences. The women who had actually built that tradition, the Devadasis themselves, were largely excluded from the new, respectable version of their own art form. Today, Bharatanatyam is celebrated globally. The girls who learn are honored. Almost none of them are taught where it came from. The women who built it were called servants of God. Then they were called prostitutes. And then they were liberated by having everything taken from them. Their art was saved, just without them. Their names are mostly gone, but as long as we remember them, they live on.